Racism in schools. The systems in our nation are systemically racist. One form of systemic racism that impacts every youth of color in our society is our school system. Barriers to intercultural communications, such as ethnocentrism, bias, stereotypes, racism, implicit bias, and privilege, have contributed to racism in schools. People of color are not represented in textbooks, teachers, administration, or at the highest levels of education compared to white people. Students of color are disciplined at a disproportionate rate compared to their white classmates. School districts that have a majority of youth of color receive less funding and less qualified teachers compared to predominantly white schools. Racism exists in our school systems, and youth of color are faced with navigating this system every day they walk into a school. Our education system has always been impacted by racism. There have been numerous court rulings that have affected our education system, but I'm going to focus on 3 today. In 1849, the Massachusetts Supreme Court ruled that segregated schools are permissible under the state's constitution, and the U.S. Supreme Court later used that case to support a separate but equal doctrine. In 1954, Brown v. Board of Education was passed, but racism in school continued to exist and continues to exist today. After desegregation in schools, black educators were largely replaced by white, middle-class educators who didn't understand the students of color in their classroom. In 1973, the Supreme Court rules that education is not a fundamental right, and that the Constitution does not require equal education expenditures within a state. The ruling has the effect of locking minority and poor children who live in low-income areas into inferior schools. Barriers to intercultural communication have played a role in the continuation of racism in schools. Ethnocentrism in education occurs when the curriculum, teaching methods, and educational strategies present the history and knowledge base of a nation from a monocultural Western European perspective that ignores the presence and/or contributions of other groups in society. Bias, stereotypes, and implicit bias have led to disproportionate discipline rates between youth of color and white youth. White parents, students, teachers, and administration have the privilege of choosing to opt in or out of racial issues and race conversations. From this graphic, you can see white students make up over half of the student population in the United States, but are not disciplined at that same rate. Students of color are suspended, expelled, and referred to law enforcement at a disproportionate rate compared to white students. Students of color represent 49% of the student population, but represent 64% of out-of-school suspensions, 64% of expulsions, 59% of students referred to law enforcement, and 61% of students subjected to a school-related arrest. The current discipline model has created the school-to-prison pipeline and forces students of color out of the classroom. Currently, across the United States, there are massive funding discrepancies between schools who have large youth of color populations compared to schools with large white populations. School districts where the majority of students enrolled are students of color receive $23 billion less in education funding than predominantly white school districts. On average, poor non-white school districts receive 19%, or about $2,600 less per student than affluent white school districts. In Arizona, where poor non-white school districts receive 36% less per student than affluent white districts, that's a difference of more than $4,400 per student. From the graphic, you can see students in the Southeast and Southwest receive less funding per student than any other part of the country. If you compare this graphic with the graphic from the previous slide, you can see the two regions that receive the least amount of funding, the Southeast and Southwest, are populated by non-white ancestry populations. The Southeast region of the United States has a large African American population, while the Southwest has a large Hispanic population. 23% of African Americans and 15% of Hispanics who are 25 years old or older have a bachelor's degree, compared to 36% of Caucasians. This is a major factor in the gap in median household income. African Americans and Hispanics have a median adjusted household income of $43,000, compared to $71,000 for Caucasians. From the two graphics, we can see the discrepancy in school funding stems from racism. To solve racism in schools will take a commitment and acknowledgement from all three levels of our education system. The federal, state, and local departments of education have to admit racism exists in our schools and commit to changing it. White people need to be allies to people of color throughout this process. At the federal level, funding discrepancies need to be addressed. School curriculums need to include the perspective from people of color. Law enforcement needs to be removed from schools because they are assisting in the school-to-prison pipeline, and a recruitment program needs to be developed for teachers of color. 79% of teachers are white. The representation in the classroom needs to change. At the state level, teacher training programs and accountability systems need to be created. Tenure needs to become a thing of the past, because at every other job, if you aren't up to the task, then you don't get to stay. At the local level or individual school districts, more staff trainings need to be established. There needs to be representation from every culture in the district on the school board, and a restorative justice model needs to replace the current discipline model. There are always implementation challenges to every proposed solution. The first challenge is getting people at all three levels of the education system to admit our school system is systemically racist. To change the allocation of funds, laws would need to be changed, such as which taxes are used for education. A major challenge would be the funding for teacher trainings, follow-up, and creation of recruitment programs. Implementing a restorative justice model will create a community environment within a school, but the teachers and administrators have to buy in for it to be successful. To communicate the proposed solutions, it will take leaders at the national, state, and local levels to explain the strategies schools will be implementing to solve racism in schools. Short-term communication and long-term engagement strategies are needed, and transparency at all three levels will be needed. Press conferences should be held at the national, state, and local levels to acknowledge intercultural communication barriers, including racism, exist in our school systems. The United States Department of Education needs to advocate for the removal of law enforcement from schools to abolish the school-to-prison pipeline, promote and fund teachers of color recruitment programs, and publicly address the funding discrepancies by providing documentation of where our education funds are being spent. State departments of education need to communicate with each school district and to all of the teachers in the state, letting them know what the expectations are in regards to ending racism in schools. Local school districts play a vital role in communicating solutions to the teachers, parents, students, and community members. School districts need to have representation from every culture on the school board to make sure everyone is heard. Through community meetings or public board meetings, each district needs to explain to the community what steps are being taken to end racism in schools and provide frequent updates on what has occurred. Thank you.